start. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming, and also the online audience. Thanks for joining in. It's my pleasure to announce Dr. Gordon Guyatt, very well known in the department, so he doesn't need an introduction, and he's going to talk about the great approach to network meta-analysis. Dr. Guyatt?
Got it. Okay, thanks very much. So the tentative plan is rationale and principles of network meta-analysis, problems with network meta-analysis to date, the output of grade in terms of network meta-analysis, grade approaches to certainty and evidence, and application and helpfulness. But there may be a modification, and the modification has to do with how the people in this room in general feel about their familiarity with the basic principles of network meta-analysis. And on the one hand, you may feel totally comfortable with the basic principles, in which case the first part of what I'm planning would be a bore, and I can either whiz through it or even just skip right past it. On the other hand, there may be people in the room who would really like to find out about the basics and how it is we put together direct and indirect evidence to get to pooled network estimates. So how many feel really comfortable with the principles and the fundamental mechanics and would just like us to whiz through that? Hands up. How many would like to seriously do the basics seriously? Hands up. Okay, that settles that. We're doing the basics. The other thing I wanted to say before I started was a semantic issue. One has a body of evidence, and one wants to know how trustworthy the evidence is, how believable it is, essentially. Well, when grade got started, we called that the quality of the evidence. Lots of other people had done it. But we defined it as our confidence in the evidence and in the estimates of the fact. Well, we went along and I found talking to clinical epidemiology audiences, that would confuse people. Because the other way people had been using quality was as a risk of bias in individual studies. And I would say quality and everybody would think I'm talking about risk of bias. And so I started to put in slides. When I say quality, I don't mean risk of bias. I mean something more confidence in the estimates of effect. And I was at a workshop in China, and on the third day, talking about quality, and it was clear after the third day, there was a woman there, and she was responding, and she was clearly talking about risk of bias in individual studies. And I said, look, I said that's not what I mean. I mean the confidence in the estimates over the body of evidence. And she said, if that's what you mean, why isn't that what you say? Right? Why not just say that? So I thought, she's right. And I actually changed in my grade writing from saying quality to saying confidence in the estimates. Because, sorry, I should have learned to turn that off. So I did that. And then some of my grades colleagues said, confidence is going to get, if you use confidence, it's going to get confused with confidence intervals. So now we're calling it certainty in the evidence, and that's what you'll see in the most current grade writings. But whether it's quality or confidence or certainty, it's all the same thing, and I may end up switching back and forth. All right, so where did this come along? There are now many disease areas where clinicians have a number of alternatives from which to choose. It's impractical to test each of the many possibilities in direct comparisons directly, and in many cases, even if it were a little more practical, the pharmaceutical industry is not terribly interested in making that sort of comparison. So what we'd ideally like to do is have a simultaneous comparison of everything that's available and to decide here's the best and here's the worst and here are things in the middle. So that's where network meta-analysis, also called mixed treatment comparisons, adjusted indirect comparisons, is new enough and that the semantic issue of what we call it isn't sorted out, and you'll see there's a number of other semantic issues that aren't sorted out. But I think network meta-analysis, which is my favorite, is probably going to win. So, what makes a systematic review systematic? Because a network meta-analysis should start with a systematic review. This audience doesn't need to know that we want a clear statement of the question with explicit eligibility criteria, a comprehensive search, a systematic assessment not only of risk of bias, but of these other elements that bear on our certainty in the estimates of effect, and duplicate judgments of key elements in this process. I point this out now because, as you will see, people who have started to do network meta-analysis sometimes forget that it would be a good idea to start with a systematic review. And I can sympathize with them to the extent that there may be 20 direct comparisons. You have to do this for 20 different direct comparisons and then consider the indirect comparisons. It's a lot of work, but it's necessary if you're going to do it well. So, in a conventional meta-analysis, we end off with a pooled estimate, which is the single best estimate of a treatment effect. There, when we generate a single best estimate, we're making an assumption. And the assumption is that the effect is similar across the patients, because there's different patients in the different studies. The intervention may be delivered differently. The outcomes may be different, measured differently, and the methodology may be high or low risk of bias. And if we generate a single pooled estimate, it's under the assumption that the effects are going to be the same across these. Because if they are not, it is problematic to generate a single estimate of the effect if the true effect differs across patients or across interventions or across outcomes. We're very familiar with that. We have assessing heterogeneity in systematic reviews. In the context of network meta-analysis, I'm going to call this the homogeneity assumption. And we need some clear language because, as you will find out, this is the inconsistency that we are worried about in conventional meta-analysis, but there are other inconsistencies that we have to start worrying about in the context of network meta-analysis, so we have to have language to keep them straight. So I'm going to refer to this, which is the usual heterogeneity in direct comparisons, which we're familiar with in conventional meta-analysis, and we're going to call this the homogeneity assumption. Okay, so we've got our direct comparisons of our various treatments, A versus B, A versus C, A versus D, B versus C, B versus D, and so on. The network meta-analysis is also going to consider something that we don't usually consider in conventional meta-analysis, which is indirect comparisons. So we are typically, let us say we are concerned with A versus B. That will be our direct comparison. But another way to get at the relative merits of A versus C, A versus B, is to compare it with C. For instance, C may be a placebo. So if, for instance, A versus C, our pooled estimate across the studies is a 50% relative risk reduction, and our B versus C is a 25% relative risk reduction, it might be reasonable to infer that A is superior to B because it did better against C. However, we might be less confident about that indirect comparison than about the direct comparison of A versus B. And I want to engage you in this presentation, so I would like to ask you, would you be less confident, say you had A versus B direct, and now you have the indirect, you're getting the relative merit of A versus B according to its relative effect on C. Why would you be less confident than in the direct comparison, and if so, why? Come on, this is C and D. You're used to interactive sessions, right? Harry.
So I have differences depending on what measure you use, but the relative risk or absolute.
We're as it turns out, in this context, we got to use odds ratios. So we're always using odds ratios. So we might have an odds ratio of A versus B, and then the odds ratio of A versus B inferred from these two odds ratios. So we're using odds ratios all the time in this. Why would, if the baseline risk was different, why would that change the odds ratios? Well, so it could be that the lower risk, the effect of A and the effect of B in comparison to C varies depending on the population, whether it's a low-risk population or a high-risk population. Okay, so one reason why you might be less confident about this is A versus C might look good because it had enrolled a more responsive population than B versus C. They might be actually equally good, but the A versus C comparisons are a more responsive population to the intervention than the B versus C. Good. So one reason you might be less confident is the populations differ. Any other reason you might be less confident? Yes? If the outcomes were measured in a slightly different way, quite right, or even in a substantially different way. So maybe the A versus C comparisons were all done over a 6-month time frame, and the B versus C comparisons were all done over a 3-year time frame. Possible. Or A versus C was, say, symptomatic vertebral fractures, and B versus C was asymptomatic vertebral fractures. So they may have measured the outcomes differently, and that could explain the apparent differences. Anything else? Baseline characteristics of the population? Yeah. So again, that's similar to what Harry was suggesting, so that the A versus B populations may differ, and the A versus C may be a more responsive population than the B versus C. Anything else? Yes. Yeah, there might be differences in study design. So these might be high risk of bias studies, these might be low risk of bias studies. Anything else? Yes. What about? Yeah, the comparator might be different. Maybe this is standard, this is placebo in one study in the A versus C, and standard care in the B versus C. So the comparators may be somewhat different. Okay, you get the idea. Another one would be A may be administered optimally, and B may be administered suboptimally. So maybe the apparent superiority of A is just because it was administered optimally, where you had a suboptimal, say a lower dose of B. So there are population, intervention, comparator, outcome, risk of bias issues that may make us generally less confident about indirect and direct comparisons. Except, I'll get to except shortly. So we have these additional assumptions that everything is the same. Now, this additional, again, a terminology issue. I warned you, it's new and people are just sorting out the semantics. So what do we call this? So with the indirect comparisons, if that indirect comparison is going to be trustworthy, the patients, the interventions, the outcomes, the methodology all have to be similar in the A versus C and B versus C. And some people are calling it a similarity assumption. The Cochrane collaboration has decided to call it the transitivity assumption. When I heard this, I said, huh? But since we're trying to coordinate grade with Cochrane with some reluctance, we're calling it the transitivity assumption as well. So we're going to be less confident. So we've decided we're going to be less confident about the indirect and the direct comparisons. The question is, how much less confident? And I'll tell you right now, this is one of the big issues. So one of the interesting things in the process is that Cochrane is taking grade quite seriously, and that means we get to negotiate and fight with each other about how to deal with issues as we're developing a methodology for dealing with network meta-analysis. And we have tended in the discussions to date to be much more skeptical about the indirect comparisons than have the Cochrane folks. Okay? So, and that will come up again. So, in general, you would think you would want to be less confident about the indirect comparisons, but the question is, how much less confident? Now, can anybody think of a way to find out how much less confident we should be about the indirect and the direct comparisons? Any way that we could, anything empirically we could do? Alfonso has an idea. Good, okay? So Alfonso says, look at the indirect and the direct in parallel, and he is absolutely right. So somebody did that. And this was published in the BMJ in 2011. And what they did is they found 12 networks where it was possible to construct direct estimates and indirect estimates. And they calculated the ratio of odds ratios. So they looked at the odds ratio of the direct and the odds ratio of the indirect. And in 16 out of 112, or 14%, they found that this ratio of odds ratios excluded 1.0. In other words, if we were talking about conventional statistical significance, the odds ratio from the direct was significantly different from the odds ratio of the indirect. These are the 112 comparisons. You'll note here are the scales here, so even what might appear to be a small difference is actually quite a big difference. And if we look across these 112, if we were able to pick them out, we would find that, we would find that 16 of them did not overlap with 1.0. A lot of them are very similar. They're near 1.0. But on the other hand, there are also some that, although they still cross, and you cannot exclude chance as an explanation, the direct and the indirect are still quite far apart. So the authors of this study concluded significant inconsistency between direct and indirect comparisons may be more prevalent than previously observed. I thought it was already pretty prevalent, but direct and indirect estimates should be combined in mixed treatment comparisons, otherwise known as network meta-analyses, after adequate assessment of the consistency of the evidence. So here's some evidence that suggests, and it's like randomized trials and observational studies. If we believe that 14% of the time they're different, that means 86% of the time they're the same. Unfortunately, and one could argue that well-done observational studies are most often yield similar results to randomized trials. The trouble is, until you do the randomized trial, you don't know whether you're in a situation where it's going to be similar or whether it's going to be different. So this is at least reason to have some doubts about the intuitive conclusion that indirect comparisons are less trustworthy may have to be taken seriously. But consider the following. Here is smoking cessation, which I'm going to use repeatedly as an example. Here's bupropion versus placebo. That's one agent to help people stop smoking. And here, low numbers are good. It means that less people are continuing to smoke. And the odds ratio here is 0.51 for bupropion versus placebo. Nicotine replacement patch versus placebo, 0.57. Notice 9 trials here, 19 trials here. Now, I would like you to do the indirect comparison in your head. On the basis of an indirect comparison of these odds ratios, where the C, this is A, this is B, and the placebo is C, what is the relative merit of bupropion and nicotine replacement patch in helping people to stop smoking? What do you think? Is one better? Is it a lot better? Is it a little better? What do you think? About the same would be one conclusion. And if there's one that appears a little better, which is it? Bupropion is perhaps a little better, but it looks about the same. And indeed, when you do the formal adjusted indirect comparison, you end up with a relative odds reduction of 10% of bupropion versus nicotine replacement patch. Very consistent. What you've said is they look about the same, maybe bupropion a little better, but a wide confidence interval. But we have a single direct comparison. And the single direct comparison shows a 52% odds reduction of bupropion versus nicotine replacement patch. Bupropion here does even better, slightly better, against the nicotine replacement patch than it did against placebo. So we've got quite a different picture of the relative merits of bupropion and nicotine replacement patch from the direct and indirect comparisons. Now, given this data set, which do you trust? Do you trust the direct comparison or do you trust the indirect comparison? What do you think? Oh, Harry thinks, it's all play of chance. Well, okay, you don't necessarily believe that. I'm glad to hear it. Okay, there appears to be a very substantial difference in the relative merit of bupropion versus nicotine replacement patch from the single direct comparison study and the many indirect comparison studies that contribute to the indirect comparison. Now, my question is, no escaping it by saying, it's all chance. Which one are you going to believe? Are you going to believe which is more trustworthy, the direct comparison or the indirect comparison? Do you have some doubt about the matter? Is there any piece of additional information that you would like to know that may bear on your doubt? Yes. You would like to know the sample size. Well, the sample size can be, I don't know what the sample size was. The confidence interval it was a sample size big enough to make you think that there's at least an 18% odds reduction with bupropion versus nicotine replacement therapy. But yeah, it's a good question, and I wish I knew, but I don't. Any other thing you might want to ask? Well, let me give you another piece of information, or I'll put it as a question. Guess who funded this bupropion versus nicotine replacement therapy study? Okay, so as you are all no doubt guessing, it was the makers of bupropion. The individuals who highlighted this in an article, it was one of 3 examples they give where they challenged us. And the challenge was, maybe the direct comparisons are not always more trustworthy than the indirect comparisons. Maybe this is a situation where the indirect comparison is more credible than the direct. So in general, we're going to believe direct comparisons more, but there may be instances in which that is not the case. All right, so now we have there is a consistency or similarity assumption, if you will, that we're used to in conventional meta-analysis. And I've called that the homogeneity assumption. It applies to all the direct comparisons that contribute to the network. And, but we've got something else. We've got that transitivity, as the Coherenites want to call it, and we've gone along with calling it that. If we're comparing A versus C, using C as a common comparator, we are assuming that in the A versus C and the B versus C, the patients are similar, the interventions are optimally administered, the comparator is similar, the outcomes are measured similarly, risk of bias, all that kind of stuff. So there's a second type of similarity that we are relying on in our network. And thirdly, so at the end we're going to get a direct estimate and an indirect estimate. And if, as in the example I just showed you with bupropion and nicotine replacement patch, the direct and indirectly you have very different estimates, you got a problem. You know, what are you going to believe? As we said in that example, maybe we're not sure what to believe. So just like when the individual trials in a conventional meta-analysis yield different results, when the direct and indirect yield different results, we got a problem. So there's three, not only the usual heterogeneity or homogeneity assumption issue, there's two other similarity assumptions that could potentially go wrong here within the context of network meta-analysis. Okay, I'm going to continue with a smoking cessation example. So there's a bunch of therapies that you might use for smoking cessation. You might give nicotine replacement therapy alone, antidepressants, drug called varenicline. You might give some combinations, nicotine replacement and antidepressants, two nicotine replacement therapy together. Okay? And here are the direct comparisons we have available. In this and subsequently, the odds ratios greater than 1 are good. In this way of summarizing the results, more people are stopping smoking with the interventions. So there are the results. So we have these direct comparisons, but what we will be able to do with the network is rely on all the indirect comparisons and thus turn this, where most of the potential paired comparisons we don't have any data, to this, where we have data for all the potential pairwise comparisons, the ones that we actually have from direct, but also using the indirect estimates, we now get to compare everything with everything else. So I'm now going to try and illustrate to you how this is done. So I'm going to use the example of antidepressants versus nicotine replacement therapy. Okay? And as it turns out, there are 3 trials that provide direct evidence on antidepressants versus nicotine replacement therapy. And the associated odds ratio is 1.34, a 34% increase in the odds of quitting smoking if you use antidepressants versus rather than nicotine replacement therapy. But there is a wide confidence interval from a 29% odds reduction to a more than doubling in odds. We also, in this case, have an indirect comparison that we can use. So we have nicotine replacement therapy versus some kind of control, and antidepressants versus some kind of control. I am going to call this a first-order loop. And what I mean by a first-order loop is that there is only one intervention that hooks up the paired comparison of interest. And it looks like, you can recognize this because it looks like a triangle. Okay. As it turns out, nicotine replacement versus control, an 85% increase in the odds of stopping smoking. Antidepressants versus control, an 88% increase in the odds of stopping smoking. Now, once again, do the indirect comparison in your heads and tell me, on the basis of this indirect comparison, what is the relative merit of nicotine replacement therapy versus antidepressants. And the answer is come on. The answer is pretty much the same. Absolutely. And indeed, when we do the calculation, the odds ratio, the formal odds ratio from the indirect comparison is about as close to 1.0 as you can get it. But note, because we have 67 comparisons here and 29 comparisons here, our confidence interval around this is actually quite a bit tighter than our confidence interval around the direct evidence. We lost, anytime you do the indirect, to have the same power, we basically need about 4 times the data in the indirect than the direct. But here we have a lot more than 4 times the data, and so the indirect yields a tighter confidence interval. But that is not the only indirect comparison that we can use. We can use less direct indirect comparisons. And here we call this a second-order loop. And we call the second-order loop is because there are 2 intervening comparisons. So nicotine replacement therapy has been compared to control, 85% odds reduction, we saw that. But another drug, varenicline, has been compared to control with a odds ratio even more impressive, more than doubling the odds of stopping smoking. And varenicline has also been compared to antidepressants and looks better. A 70% increase in the odds of stopping smoking with varenicline relative to antidepressants. Now, who in their head can do the indirect comparison that how does this second order loop bear on our decision about which is better, antidepressants or nicotine replacement therapy? Can anybody in their heads tell us what this second order loop tells us about the relative merit of antidepressants versus nicotine replacement therapy? Anybody? Antidepressants are not quite as good as nicotine replacement therapy. Right. Harry has recently retired or about to retire, but Harry is still sharp. We've just seen that, okay? All right. So, so let me fill you in what Harry deduced there. If you look at the indirect comparison of varenicline and nicotine replacement therapy, varenicline is better, but this 2.68 isn't that much better than 1.85. So small to moderately better. But if you look at varenicline versus antidepressants, this 1.7 is very impressive. So varenicline, on the basis of a direct comparison, looks a lot better than antidepressants, but on the basis of an indirect comparison, only moderately better than nicotine replacement therapy. So if this is much better than this, but only moderately better than this, then this, on the basis of an indirect comparison, is a little better than that. And indeed, 0.85 means antidepressants not as good as nicotine replacement therapy. So there is how the second order loop allows us to make a deduction between the relative merits of our primary interventions of interest. Yes? I'm not sure. The question was, as we get farther and away, does the reliability of the estimate go down? I don't know what you mean. I'm not sure what you mean by the reliability, but I can tell you the variance gets inflated. Okay? So each time you have another, as you go from, I've told you, you need 4 times the data for the first order loop versus the direct comparison. And I don't know how much more you need to get the same precision with the second order, but a lot more. Each time you add another intervening treatment, your variance shoots up, and as a result, your confidence interval gets much wider. Does that address the question? Good. Okay. So indeed, here, this one has a very wide confidence interval. Now, there are a whole bunch of these indirect comparisons that you can get from this data set. And it always sort of reminds me of a pinball machine. So anytime you see something ding, 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 anyway, anytime you can connect them, you can generate one of these estimates. And here, each one of these colors, we've talked about the direct comparison, and we've also talked about the gold or yellow. That was the first order loop. We've also talked about this red second order loop, but there's all these other loops as well that can bear on it. And each of these loops generates its own point estimate and generates its own confidence interval around that point estimate. So now we're going to put this all together. So we have our direct evidence, which I showed you at the beginning, a 34% increase in the odds with antidepressants versus nicotine, but a wide confidence interval. And we have these 5 indirect comparisons, and we can get a pooled indirect comparison across these 0.5, which is pretty close to 1.0. It is dominated by the first order loop because that has the smallest variance and it also had the most studies. And we can then pool the pooled indirect comparison with the pooled direct comparison, and we get something very close to 1.0. dominated. Look at that nice narrow confidence interval, much wider confidence interval. Here, the pool of the direct and indirect is dominated by the indirect because there's lots more data. So even with this inflation of the variance with the indirect, because there's so much more data, the pooled comparison is dominated by the indirect. So what are the messages? The message is, in general, all else being equal, the direct will dominate, but if there's a lot more indirect evidence, that may dominate. Each time you get a more indirect loop, the variance goes up, the confidence interval widens, it contributes less, so the first order loops are likely to contribute more than the second or third order loops. But in the end, we put together the indirect and the direct for our network estimate. Okay, so I hope that what I've done over the last few minutes gives you a good idea of how basically the thing works. Any questions at this point? Okay, all right. So there are two basic statistical approaches. One is a frequentist methods based on the basis of simple indirect comparisons, and a Bayesian approach. The Bayesian approach tends to be much more popular. It was the first software out to do this, and it was, as I understand it, I can't figure out any software, but for the people who can, they were telling me this is very complicated, but I think it's got better. But there's now software out to do this. So you'll see most of them you'll see will be Bayesian. You can do it in a frequentist approach and get the same stuff out of it. And what's better, what are the relative merits of the Bayesian or frequentist remains to be seen. So now, there's there's been an explosion of these network meta-analysis. They are hot. But most of them are very limited. So, as I alluded to earlier, some don't do rigorous systematic reviews. So here's a paper that was published in 2013 in the BMJ, and their conclusion was essential methodologic components of the systematic review process, conducting a literature search and assessing risk of bias, are frequently lacking in reports of the network meta-analysis, even when published in journals with high impact factors. Okay, so I'm sympathetic to all the work that would be required by actually doing that, but it's a problem if you don't do it. But there is a second big problem, perhaps an even bigger problem. And that bigger problem is that the certainty of the effects is very likely to differ across outcomes. In other words, you've got paired comparison between A and B, and you've got a paired comparison between F and G. It may well be that the A and versus B is very trustworthy, low risk of bias, high sample size, it's precise, no inconsistency, direct, no worries about publication bias. But the F versus G is just the opposite. High risk of bias, imprecise, everything's wrong with it. The A versus B, we have very high confidence. The F versus G, we have very low confidence. So far, this problem has been, I don't think I'm exaggerating, ignored by most network meta-analysis. They just say, overall, this network looks good. Well, maybe overall the network does look good, but it's almost certain that some paired comparisons are going to be much more trustworthy than other paired comparisons. And that has been ignored, and that, we believe, is a big problem. And that is what GRADE has tried to address. As it turns out, there are two GRADE approaches out there to address this. One was developed by this group of people from the Cochrane collaboration, the famous ones, if one believes in fame in our little world here, Georgia Salanti and Julian Higgins. They are not members of the GRADE working group. Okay? So this is a very interesting, as a person who's been very contributed to and very invested in GRADE, it's very interesting and very nice when we propose an approach to determine confidence in the outward, and that our proposed approach is based on the methodology developed by the GRADE working group for pairwise meta-analysis. So here's somebody who aren't even members of GRADE, smart people who take the methodology of GRADE and develop their own approach. Meanwhile, the grade working group, published in this paper, was developing our approach. And we were talking to each other. So in our first draft of this paper, we send it to Julian in particular, and I think probably to Georgia, and they said, you guys don't know what you're doing. You know, this is like, nobody's going to, you put this out, nobody's going to pay any attention to this. And they were probably right. Not necessarily that we were misguided, but that the thinking in the people who do the network meta-analysis did not fit with our thinking. But we've revised, and we've got something that now is, I think, acceptable to the network meta-analysis community. And as I understand it, the next version of the grade handbook is going to give two approaches. They're going to show their approach, and they're going to show our approach. As you will probably guess, what I'm about to do is not tell you about their approach, but rather tell you about our approach. All right, and I'm going to use this particular network meta-analysis. This has to do with how we should try to prevent fractures in people with osteoporosis. And there are these whole bunch of treatments that have been used in people with osteoporosis. And you can see vitamin D and calcium has been most studied, and to see a lot of these things as usual, there's more comparisons with placebo than there are head-to-head comparisons. And this is what comes out of the grade approach. So, let us look at teriparatide versus placebo. Well, actually, let's look at raloxifene versus placebo. First, we have the direct estimate, and then we have our certainty in the direct estimate. Then we have the indirect estimate. Then we have our certainty in the indirect estimate. Then we have the network estimate that pools the direct and indirect, and our certainty in that. And we have it for every paired comparison that can come out of this. You can imagine the work that goes into this, not only the calculations, but the certainty of the estimates of effect for both direct and indirect. Now, you may say, how is any human being ever going to make sense of such a table? That's another question which I'm not going to talk about, but we're thinking about that remains a challenge, and we're thinking about how to do it. But this gives you, we believe, this gives you what you need. The rest of this talk is going to be about how we get there. How do we get from the direct comparisons that are the raw data for this network meta-analysis to this table? All right, basic approach. First of all, we've got to separate the direct and indirect comparisons. This, by the way, has not been part of the tradition of most network meta-analysis. They say, here's our network estimate, and they don't tell you about what the direct did and what the indirect did. So we think you should separate the two things. Getting the estimate from the direct is straightforward. That's standard meta-analysis. You do a meta-analysis, you pick your fixed effect model or your random effects model, and for each direct comparison you get your estimate. Now, how to get the estimates of the indirect, how to separate. You know, we have A versus B. We have the direct estimate, and we have all these loops going into contributing to direct, indirect estimate. How do we get the indirect estimate? The answer is by some, to me, mysterious statistical approach that they call node splitting. I have no idea what node splitting really means, except I do know that if you do this node splitting, you get an indirect estimate. So each of these indirect estimates, when there's the direct available, comes from this node splitting approach. So it can be done. That's all I know. Okay, so in the grade approach, we start with getting our direct estimates just from conventional meta-analyses, and then we get our indirect estimates, which come from this node splitting approach. And I'm going to focus on alendronate versus raloxifene, one of the many comparisons that I showed you on the previous slide. Okay, so here we have our direct and indirect. You might note already that the direct couldn't have had much in the way of sample size given that confidence interval. So the next step is we're going to rate the confidence or certainty or quality of the direct and indirect estimates. And how are we going to do that? Well, in the direct comparisons, it's very straightforward in the sense that over the last decade or so, for 15 years or so, grade has developed how we think we should do that. And it means that randomized trials, which so far almost all meta-networks are randomized trials, probably a good thing. So randomized trials are going to start with high certainty, but we're going to consider risk of bias, imprecision, inconsistency, indirectness, and publication bias, and possibly rate down our certainty on the basis of each of these. So, alendronate versus raloxifene, the direct comparison, we didn't find risk of bias. Imprecision, we got serious imprecision. Boy, do we have serious imprecision. Inconsistency, only one study. Indirectness, and we didn't detect publication bias. So, this is so bad imprecision, one might rate down 1 to make it moderate, but one might rate down 2 to make it low. And again, this is grade. The merit of grade is that people looking at the same data are not always going to get the same, can come to the same conclusion, particularly when there's close calls, and there'll be lots of close calls. Judgments may differ, but we have explicit and transparent criteria. So, now, that's fine, we're okay, but how are we going to get our estimate of our certainty or confidence in the indirect estimate? Much more tricky, okay? And the first issue is one I've already alluded to. Where do you start with the indirect evidence? In general, we said, you need the A versus C and B versus C, populations need to be the same, interventions administered optimally, comparators the same, risk of bias the same, outcome measures the same, and we decided intuitively we might be less confident of those indirect comparisons. When grade, starting 15 years ago and first published about 10 years ago, when we were initially developing it, it was before network meta-analysis had appeared in a serious way in the scene. But we considered that there might be only indirect comparisons available, and we said, if there's only indirect comparisons, we're going to start at moderate. In other words, we're sufficiently skeptical of these indirect comparisons, we don't want to start them as high. Direct RCTs, A versus B, start as high. If you have to go through C, we start as moderate. However, the network meta-analysis enthusiasts argue differently. They say it's really not very different. Even if we're doing a conventional meta-analysis, we have to assume populations are the same, interventions are the same, comparisons are the same, etc. So we think that so we have this dialogue with them. Eventually, we surrender and we say, okay, we are switching the grade guidance and we are going to start indirect as high. Okay? It all starts as high. And then we'll only rate down if there's this lack of similarity. If we see differences in the patients, interventions are not measured, are not given optimally in both arms, comparators, etc. Okay? So we're only going to rate down, to use the terminology that we've ended up adopting, we're only going to rate down if we see intransitivity. Now, there's no statistical test for intransitivity. Intransitivity is in the eye of the beholder. So that means there's always judgment involved, but lots of judgment for this, and the issue is where you set the threshold. And in general, so in the Coherence grade paper, they circulated to us at first, and they said, we see no reason to rate down for intransitivity on any of our indirect comparisons. And they sent it to us. Andy Oxman in particular feels strongly about this point, and they listened to Andy quite easily, more so than they listened to me, I found. But anyway, Andy writes to them and says, you can't do this, you're not, this is. So they rated down a bunch for intransitivity on the basis of Andy's feedback. But there's this tension about how you consider this intransitivity. So, now we got another problem, okay? We have multiple indirect loops. So how are we going to deal with multiple indirect loops? The Cochrane Knights have in their approach, they have an extremely sophisticated statistical way of doing it. We're a lot simpler. Okay, so let's take vitamin D and calcium. Does anybody see a first-order loop there? Comparing vitamin D and calcium to raloxifene, does anybody see a first-order loop? If you do, what is the link in that first-order loop? Yes, here's a first-order loop, a triangle, right? Here we have we know what vitamin D and calcium does with alendronate. We know what raloxifene does against alendronate, and that would allow us to make a first-order loop indirect comparison. Is there another first-order loop there? What's the link? Yeah, there's another one. It's placebo here. We have another triangle, okay? Which, if you had to pick one of these first-order loops, which one would you pick? Note, the width of these lines reflect the amount of data available. So which one would you pick? Yeah, this is a thicker line than this is. These lines are both pretty thin. So we call this the dominant loop through placebo. Okay? So that's the one that's going to contribute most to the indirect comparison. And what we do to keep life manageable is we're going to get our confidence in the indirect estimate from the dominant loop. That's how we suggest you approach it. So A versus B is the comparative instrument. The dominant loop goes through C. So what do you do if A versus C is high certainty and B versus C is moderate or low? What is your certainty in that indirect comparison? What do you think? Say, this one's high, this one's low. What's your certainty in the indirect comparison? Low. Right. That's what we think. And the reason we think that low is correct is you're making this inference of A versus B on the basis of these two. If one of these is low, how can you do any better than the worst of the two directs that are contributing to the indirect estimate? So pretty clear, we think that if you have this, that you should take the lowest, that you should take the lowest, okay? So A versus B is our comparison of interest. We're doing it through A versus C and B versus C. If this is moderate and this is low, we're going to say that that our certainty in the indirect estimate of A versus B is low. Okay? Everybody okay with that? All right. So, more about confidence in the indirect comparisons. This is just what I said. Okay, so we get the lower of the two, but are we going to rate down further if there is intransitivity, right? We've just looked at our certainty in A versus C. We've looked at our B versus C. We haven't considered whether A versus C is really appropriately comparable with A versus C with B versus C. Okay? So the answer is yes. If we see intransitivity, it goes down one more. And I've told you about the challenges of deciding whether we see important intransitivity. Okay, back to alendronate versus raloxifene, which is the comparison I put in the table. Do you see a direct loop? Do you see a first-order loop there? And it's going through? Yeah, it's going through vitamin D and calcium. As it looks like there's no no head-to-head comparisons between alendronate and placebo, so we've lost that. So it's going through vitamin D and calcium. So The indirect is through vitamin D and calcium. Vitamin D and calcium versus raloxifene is moderate due to imprecision. Vitamin D and calcium versus alendronate is moderate due to risk of bias. The overall, our certainty in the overall, so far, our certainty in the indirect estimate is moderate, right? They're both moderate, our certainty is moderate. Anything else needed would be, is there intransitivity? And I think we decided there was no problem with intransitivity. So here, for the direct evidence, we decided to rate down 2 because this goes from a 96% odds reduction to a 5-fold increase in odds. That's almost no information. Okay, so we're going to call this low certainty. Here in the raloxifene versus calcium vitamin D and the alendronate versus calcium vitamin D are moderate. We don't think there's intransitivity, so our indirect evidence is moderate quality or certainty. Okay? Next step is generate your network estimate. So the network estimate is the combination of these two, and as usual, putting together the direct with the indirect, it's somewhere between the two. Pretty straightforward. Then we have to rate our confidence or certainty in the network estimate. So how do we decide? If only direct or only indirect, that's easy. We use that for our network estimate and certainty. If you have both direct and the indirect, let's assume the point estimates are similar. What if the certainty differs? The direct is, say, moderate and the indirect low. What is your certainty in the network? Low? Everybody agree? Certainty in the network is low? Yes? No. Harry, bingo once again. Why not? Oh, well, what were you going to say? You would say moderate. Okay, good. So Harry agrees with us. Do you want to give us your rationale? Yeah. Okay. So Harry said these point estimates are similar, so that is the basis on which you could take the higher. And indeed, this follows the logic. It follows the logic of what grade recommends in conventional meta-analysis. What if you have 5 high risk of bias studies and 5 low risk of bias studies? Okay, let's assume you have that. And now you're going to make and the results are similar. What is your risk of bias going to be? Is it going to be high risk of bias or low risk of bias? It's going to be low risk of bias. The reason is that risk of bias is just that. It's risk. We don't know in an individual situation whether lack of concealment was really a problem, or whether lack of blinding was really a problem, or whether loss to follow-up was really a problem. It just puts it at risk. And if the trustworthy evidence yields similar estimates to the less trustworthy evidence, we can deduce that in this particular situation, there wasn't a problem with risk of bias. Same thing here. These estimates of a certainty are estimates based on, issues that are really risk issues. So if these are similar, and there's one other logic. If you had 1 degree of certainty, why would you add another body of evidence that lowered your certainty? Why would you ever do that? You have 1 certainty, oh, now we'll put the other together and we'll be less certain. Does that make any sense? No, it does not make any sense. And that was our initial fight with the Cochranites, right? We said, if you have high, why bother, if you have high in the direct, why bother to look at the indirect? That made their hair stand on end because, they believe in the network estimates. So this is the solution to the problem, okay? So yes, if you have high certainty in the direct, but the indirect will add evidence to it with similar estimates, then you can add it and stay with high certainty. So that's how everybody got the logic? Agree or not? That's our logic, and that's what we recommend. So, what if the direct and indirect are very different? Okay, again, a terminology issue. We use heterogeneity for direct, transitivity for indirect, and incoherence for problems with direct versus indirect. This time, Cochrane, I think, decided to use dissimilarity for this, but to us, this is all similarity. So in terminology, we parted company, and we think you need different names for all these three, and incoherence is the one we use if the direct and indirect do not agree. All right. So, judging coherence. How do you judge coherence? Well, any ideas? How would you judge coherence? Okay? So we have our direct and our indirect. How are you going to make the judgment whether it's coherent or incoherent? In other words, whether it's similar or dissimilar. Any thoughts? Well, how do we judge heterogeneity in a conventional meta-analysis? We have a forest plot. Well, how do you judge? How do you say, oh, we have problematic heterogeneity, or things look pretty good? Yes. I squared would be one. No I squared here, so we don't have I squared. Any other thoughts? Sorry? Yeah, okay. So do the confidence intervals, or in this case, good terminology in Bayesian, do the credible intervals overlap? Are they widely overlapping, or are they not overlapping? What else? Yeah, whether the point estimates are different. If the point estimates are close or the point estimates are far away. Okay? So point estimates close, you're okay. Point estimates far away, you got a problem. Confidence intervals widely overlapping, you're okay. Confidence intervals not overlapping, you got a problem. And there is a statistical test that can help you, which is basically the equivalent of the old test for heterogeneity that we relied on before I squared came around. Okay, so difference in point estimate, extent of overlap, and p-values for what we call the test for incoherence, since we're calling this incoherence. Okay, now what do you do if there's incoherence? What do you do? What do you do now? If what? Oh. Okay, so Harry is a hitter who's hit 3 home runs so far in the course of this. Harry has said, if one of these, for instance, is high, and one of them is moderate low or very low, we should believe the one that's high, that we have high certainty in. Absolutely right. Okay? However, this also makes the Cochraneite's hair stand on end, although less so than when we just said we'll always do this. Okay? At first we said we're always going to believe the highest, and if it's high, we don't need to go further. They absolutely couldn't stomach that. But what Harry has just said seems very logical to us. If you have 2 bodies of evidence that disagree, you have higher certainty in one than the other, you're going to believe the one with the higher certainty. The Cochranites just they say, you're in a network, you believe the network. Okay? So the 2 possibilities are focus on the highest confidence or certainty and use that as your rating, use that as your best estimate and that as your rating, or focus on the network. But as far as we're concerned, if you focus on the network and you're putting together, that means you're saying we're treating these 2 bodies of discordant evidence as credible, you've got to rate down for the incoherence. So you're going to end up likely with quite a low rating. So here's an example. This was reamed versus unreamed fractures. Our direct evidence, a 26% odds reduction, fairly wide confidence interval, moderate. Our indirect, a 93% odds reduction, almost no overlap in the confidence intervals. This is low. Okay? So we might say, okay, we'll take the moderate, but we've got to rate down for the incoherence. So the pooled estimate, the best it's going to do is low. P-value for the test of incoherence, by the way, here is 0.02, so chance cannot explain the difference, easily explain the difference between those two. So your choices are believe that on the basis of moderate certainty or believe that on the basis of low certainty. Seems clear to us that you should believe this on the basis of moderate certainty, although the Coherenites disagree. All right. This is basically what I said. Okay. So now we're at the end of so we're back to the whole thing again, and we're back to the end of the process. And so in this table, here's the one we focused on. One line in this table has the direct estimates for alendronate versus raloxifene and its certainty, the indirect and its certainty, the network and its certainty. So any paired comparison that you are interested in, you're the clinician, and you say, well, I'm used to using alendronate, but the guy next door, the woman next door uses raloxifene. I wonder what their relative merits are, and then you can go to the appropriate line. However, as I said before, the clinicians are liable to say, tell me which is best. And that's a whole other issue where Lawrence has led us in producing a paper about the approaches to doing that. So, I'm going to talk some about that. So one of the ways of solving this problem is to give the clinicians exactly what they want. Give them a ranking. Tell them, this is best, this is second best, this is third best. Wonderful. Then they just have to go out and use whatever you told them is best. However, this is potentially very misleading, we think. First of all, the difference between first and second might be very small. So you just tell them, this is first, okay, they go to the first, but maybe the first and second were very close, and the first, second, and third were very close. What if the whole thing is based on low or very low confidence? Okay, this is best, but we actually have no idea. Okay, or maybe even worse, the one that's best, all the comparisons are low or very low, and the one that's second best, they're all high, right? Just because what goes into the network is just the numbers, nothing to do with risk of bias, nothing to do with the other reasons for raising down. So we believe that the grade approach can greatly ameliorate this problem. Here's an example that illustrates the problem. Here is the initial, in our grade paper, we use this vitamin, the various treatments for osteoporosis reducing fractures. But a network meta-analysis, Hassan Murad, who led this, collaborated with us on the grade, but he published his own network first. And here's what Hassan and his colleagues said. Teriparatide had the highest risk reduction of fractures, odds ratios 0.42, 0.305 for hip vertebral and non-vertebral, and the highest probability of being ranked first for efficacy, probabilities of 42, 49, to 79%. Looks like we should use teriparatide. Yes, first, number one. Okay, here is the story. Teriparatide versus placebo has no direct evidence. The indirect evidence has this very wide confidence interval and has all sorts of other problems and is very low. Here's your pooled estimate, very low for the network. This is the one that's being recommended. Whereas if you looked at zolendronate versus placebo, we have high confidence. It's a little bit, the point estimate is not quite as good, but here you have high confidence for a 50% odds reduction, a very low confidence in the 58% odds reduction, and yet the network, when you do the rankings, this one comes out first. Clearly very misleading. So how does grade solve the problem? It not only tells you this, but it tells you this. It tells you what the credibility of your comparisons are. So I'm going to take the last few minutes to tell you about one that we published earlier this year in the Annals of Internal Medicine. Patients who are septic are at high risk of dying. And a big deal is what resuscitation fluids you give them. And there's a lot of questions about what resuscitation fluid you give them. So we did a network meta-analysis of this. And here's what happens when you do your ranking. This balanced crystalloid, these are just different ways of giving the fluid, ranks number 1. And this sucra statistic is one way of doing the ranking. It gives the highest sucra. Albumin gives the second highest, and so on. Okay? So it looks like this is your first choice, everybody. When you get septic, this is what you want to give you. Okay. Here are the table with all the estimates, the direct, the indirect, and the certainty here. It isn't in a separate column here. This is moderate, this is very low, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so let's look at balanced crystalloid versus albumin. Do we really trust this? Well, balanced crystalloid versus albumin, they look basically about the same, and it's only very low confidence. So do we really have any credibility in that balanced crystalloid is better than albumin? No, we do not. What about balanced crystalloid versus light starch? The balanced crystalloid looks much better than the light starch. This one, the pooled estimate is a 25 reduction in odds, and this is moderate. So in fact, there's probably pretty good reason to give the balanced crystalloid rather than the light starch. What about balanced crystalloid versus gelatin? Okay, so here again, balanced crystalloid looks better. Balanced crystalloid versus gelatin, very low certainty. So balanced crystalloid versus light starch looks kind of similar, but that one you can trust. Balanced crystalloid versus gelatin you can't really trust. When we submitted this to the annals, we pointed all this out in our discussion. So the annals said, probably appropriately, this ranking is so misleading that we're not allowing you to put it in. So it's been, I think they made the right decision, because the ranking really, clinicians just, what are the clinicians going to do? What are they liable to do? They look at that. And if we put it in the abstract, oh my God, they'll just read the conclusion and that'll be it. Forget it. All these subtleties that some things you can believe and some things you can't, they'll be gone. Okay, so they were probably right. But the point being, A, that these rankings can be profoundly misleading, and B, that the grade approach, telling you what you can be certain about and what you can't be certain about, is a remedy for the potentially misleading rankings. Okay, now, who is considering doing a network meta-analysis? Okay, quite a few people. Okay, now, what is going to happen to you if you use the grade approach for your network meta-analysis? Okay? Here was the paper that we submitted to the annals. And the top journals typically have a statistical reviewer. And here is what the statistical reviewer said about our paper. This might go on my gravestone. This is an interesting and technically well done NMA. We found the author's approach to critical appraisal and assessing the strength of evidence particularly valuable in assessing the overall credibility of the findings. Assessing the amount and quality of the information contained in the network meta-analysis is an area of concern that deserves more attention. Most authors to date simply rely on the risk of bias assessments based solely on the pairwise comparisons. The system employed, if they do that, some of them don't even do that, the system employed by these authors uses this level of critical appraisal as one element and extends their assessment to judging the strength of evidence for indirect effects and the overall as well as direct effect. The results of their assessment are quite striking and revealing. This work alone is worthy of a standalone methods and reporting manuscript, but this is not the primary purpose of the current manuscript. How would you like to get a review like that? Okay? And of course, the methods and reporting manuscript that is referring to is the one we published in BMJ, which is what I've been telling you today, the grade approach to network meta-analysis. In conclusion, network meta-analysis requires quality rating for each paired comparisons. We would argue if they just do what they usually do, oh, this network is pretty good, okay? Very problematic, because you can be sure that there's some things in there you can trust and some things that you cannot trust. Give grade provides an explicit and transparent. We think we're good about explicitness and transparency. 4-step process with guidance provided at each step. We're still early on. I've only been involved in a few of them now, so we're clearly going to look more, but we believe we've got a good start. So, got just a couple of minutes. Any final questions, comments, or reflections on any of this? Okay, thanks very much. Good luck with your network meta-analysis. Yes, you can have the microphone.